testing is hands down the best way to test for metals. Dr. Hart here. We got Dr. Sylvester. We're in Tennessee. Love to have this guy up from Florida. We're on the Outside podcast today. We're going to tell you why you need a hair test. Doc, what's hair testing? Why is it important?
Hair testing is a great way to look at what's going on over the last 3 months with our biochemistry, mineralization, toxic exposures. It's non-invasive, it's easy, cheap, convenient, and gives a wealth of information we're talking about today. I'm really
Everybody
excited.
loves easy, cheap, and convenient.
Yeah.
It's the American dream.
Where do we start?
Right. So what we're really looking at with hair testing, a couple of things. First, what's your toxin load, right? We can see different heavy metals. We're going to talk about today why we're looking at different ways to look at mercury specifically, but also things like lead, aluminum, arsenic, right? All those nasty metals that we can get in the environment. But also, it's a great way to look at our minerals, right? We can see, are you too high in certain minerals, too low? We're going to dive into what some of the ratios mean and all the different things you can see just from a few strands of hair, maybe more than a few, of what's going on in the body from all the different body systems, right? So we're going to talk about that. Why hair testing is important. It is hands down the best way for us to look at what's your toxin load as far as heavy metals go. Okay. So I'm gonna have Dr. Sylvester in a second talk about why we don't use urine testing or provocation testing or blood testing for heavy metals, but why we focus on the hair. But it is the best way for us to look at what's going on with your minerals, what's going on with your metals, and then an easy and affordable way to look at all sorts of things like blood sugar control, connective tissue, bone health. We can use the minerals to tell us that. But why shouldn't people use blood or trust urine testing? And why is provocation testing maybe even dangerous?
We got a lot of good questions. So let's start with that one. I mean, I'm just excited. I'm excited to be here in Tennessee. I'm excited about this topic. The mistakes. I guess we'll start with mistakes because one common thing, the Western world doesn't know how to find a lot of these problems. They don't think to ask why illnesses are even showing up in somebody. So sometimes the best functional doctors say, well, I do want to ask why. I do want to look. They don't always know the mechanisms that present each different mineral derangement, metal exposure, because it's quite complex. It's an entire field called toxicokinetics. One common problem are things called provoked urine challenges. So that's basically when you give an agent which might provoke the body to dump what may or may not be there. The problem is the provoking agents are all different. They all provoke different things. People's biology, their chemistry, their fat, their pH, all the variations in all of us can change the outcomes. Their renal excretion rate, there's too many variables. Most importantly, it could be harmful. You could actually uncover and acutely poison someone with their own body stores.
Yeah, I always, when a patient asks, I say, I had a functional doctor who, and these guys are well-meaning or gals, right? But a functional doctor who wanted to do a provocation test on me, said it was the best way. Why don't you want me to do that? And I'll give some examples from my own case files. One gal, MS case, her functional doctor, before she came to see me, had found heavy metals, and he was exactly right. But he did a provocation test and then some IV treatments with chelation agents. And what happened was she went from not needing a wheelchair to being stuck 24/7 in the wheelchair because that provocation test moved the metals all around and then got redistributed for her. That's one case. I had another case who came to see me, did really well. Then one of her doctors said, hey, we're going to provoke to see if you still have heavy metals, did a provocation test. It took me nearly 10 years to get her back to that baseline level of health that she was at, because that moved so much mercury out of her brain that it put her back. It set her back 10 years.
I see it all the time. Frequently, the patients I see that show up to my clinic are after an injury from a well-respected functional doctor. It was what got me really interested in this, because how would I, know any different than a lot of these functional doctors, some that have been doing this 10, 20, 30 years, still making what I consider now to be rookie mistakes. Allopathic training can come in handy. It's not in and of itself something that's evil. And unfortunately, Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy don't always see eye to eye and integrate their wisdom, their collective wisdom. So I think that what has put me in a very unique situation is not only having a different background, not only as an engineer, but as an allopath and as a functional doctor, but also having to deal with mercury myself
Yeah.
and being told by both establishments this either doesn't exist or your reaction, your response to treatments is in your mind. It's actually not causing injury. I can speak of tons of case files personally of people that were ambulatory that now can't get out of bed for 3 months or more. I myself was injured by IV glutathione.
Yeah.
IV glutathione is supposed to be good for removing metals. The concept is you cannot undo decades and decades of a burden of a metal in an hour. It's our biology is just not designed to do that. So that is a common mistake, and it's a very serious one. I had somebody that was given a D-chelator and immediately started having seizures, and it was not a reaction to the chelator. It wasn't an anaphylactic reaction. It was moving too much metal too soon. I sent you a picture years ago of a patient that had a large, like Quasimodo bump on their back
Yeah.
because it was ripping metal too hard through the tissues.
Yeah.
So that is a very common mistake. I see it all the time, sadly.
Yeah, it is. You know, that's the beauty of Dr. Sylvester and I working together quite often is coming from the allopathic and then bridging it into functional integrative, coming from more the functional and biological medicine, bringing integrative. And you know, it makes me think growing up around Captain Plan with our powers combined.
Wonder Twins.
That's right.
Activate.
Yeah.
We'll work on
Okay.
your beard.
I like my beard. Okay. You know, it's funny. We'll talk about that. My beard, before I started getting my copper balance right, was much more red. I had all that Irish red in it, and it really evened out when I got my copper balanced out. And so we'll talk more about that. So we talked about, you know, what testing not to do, right? We don't want to do blood testing. It's just not accurate enough in the long run. We don't want to do provocation tests because they can be dangerous and don't give us a good indication. So we want to talk about why we love. Go ahead.
We didn't talk about why blood testing is
You
not
did.
good
I just
enough.
thought it. Tell why we don't like
blood testing. Blood is a dynamic fluid that's constantly circulating, constantly changing, especially minerals like sodium and potassium. They can change within minutes. Hours can be a long time. Now, hair samples blood 24/7 and grows at a slow rate. So these minerals and the derangements and toxins, they're laid down in the matrix of the hair and are collected like tree rings over time. So we can get an overall snapshot. Blood is actually the worst place to look for heavy metals. Urine is slightly better because at least it collects and samples blood for 8 hours. But hair by far it's non-invasive, unlike having to stick a needle and draw blood from somebody. But it gives you a wealth of information, not just accurate information, but trends and exposures and effects on systems, which we're going to talk about with the ratios and a lot of the deeper interpretation methods.
Yeah. So hair, safe, affordable, easy, right? Those are very good reasons in and of themselves. But now let's talk into why it's so accurate to help us find maybe hidden heavy metal stores. And so that's where we talk about a concept we call mineral derangement, where we're looking at how are the minerals balanced or imbalanced. And so we're going to talk about the ratios and how we can use those to find trapped or hidden heavy metals. So when we look at a hair test, we do look at, what are the metal loads in the hair. So some of those are really good in the hair to tell us what's in the body: lead, arsenic, aluminum, right? Those are great ones to tell us what's in the body. So if they're high, we know they're high. If they're low, they're probably low. Mercury's not a good one to look at. So if it's high in the hair, fine. If it's low, it doesn't mean you're good. That's where we need to look at the mineral derangement, where the minerals are imbalanced. So for instance, mercury will displace lithium, which is really great for mood stabilization and B12 absorption. It will displace selenium, which we need for a thyroid, heavy metal detox, and antioxidant, right? And there's a few more, but it's really, we're looking at some of those derangements to see what's out of balance in that and what points to mercury. So, there's different things where there's certain, what Doc likes to call a rubric, right? We're looking at certain algorithms of what's shifting in those minerals that tells us to trapped ratios or trapped maybe mercury. What are some of those that maybe if you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, mercury's an interesting one because it can mimic almost any 2+ ion. So that it could be certain states of iron. That certainly can be lithium, magnesium,
Hmm.
molybdenum. So it can really wreak havoc on the minerals management systems of the body. I think the reason why it's missed so much is because doctors don't understand the bigger picture of the process and the adaptation strategies. They are used to drawing blood, looking at a level and a reference range. And to your point, mercury, a metal like mercury can hide. Even
Yeah.
lead, if it's been a long exposure, it can actually be hard to find because 95% of it sits locked into the bone marrow and
Yeah.
leads to bone marrow dyscrasias, blood problems, blood cancers, even bone cancers.
Yeah.
So it has a lot to do with understanding the unique toxicity of a unique metal and a unique biology and the unique footprint. That's where I think a lot of people get confused,
Yeah.
even the experts.
Yeah. You need a hair test, right?
You need it.
Yeah. Okay. So we can see why. Look, if you think you're dealing with heavy metals, you think you're dealing with mercury, just in general, as we'll see in a second, a hair test is a great way to look at tons of body systems. Okay, super useful. So hands down, if you think you suspect heavy metals in your system, you need a hair test. Okay, you need a hair test. Okay, so let's talk a little about some of the mineral balancing and some of the different ratios that we can look at. So it's a whole list of different minerals we go over. We're going to talk about some of the different ratios. What can some of these things tell us? They can tell us what's your adrenal function. They can tell us what type of metabolizer you are, what's your metabolic type. We can look at connective tissue, bone repair, bone ratios. We can look at neuropsychiatric issues potentially. Like, is there things that your minerals may be contributing to anxiety, depression, all those sort of things. How's your blood sugar? What's your emotional state? Right? We can look at all these different factors looking at minerals. So I'll start with a blood sugar ratio, calcium, magnesium. Okay. We can look at if your calcium magnesium ratio is too high or too low, either which way, we know your body is not handling blood sugar well. Your carbohydrate metabolism is probably not good. So, in that front, not only are we going to want to balance those minerals out, maybe you need more calcium, magnesium, maybe you need both a certain ratio, but then I might say, hey, we need to restrict some of your refined sugars and carbohydrates because you just can't tolerate them right now until we get this calcium magnesium level right. Right. And so that's also a calcium on that front. There's different things like calcium shelling and things we look at that trap some of the minerals, but that's a really easy way for us to say, what's your blood sugar metabolism doing? What's your carbohydrate metabolism? But also if that ratio is off, like if it's too high, or if your cal mag's too high and stuck what we call a right shift, you might be real ramped up. You might be real neurotic, real anxious, right? If it's too low, you might be real depressed, down, slow moving. You might still be anxious, but you can't do anything with the anxious energy. You're too depleted. So we're looking at acute emotional states also with that cal mag ratio.
And blood sugar management. The thing that's great about all these ratios, in the first place I start is what we call validity testing.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to make sure the hair sample is
Yeah.
valid. You got to make sure it's not contaminated with shampoos or dyes
Mm-hmm.
or external things that build up on the hair. Ratios are the metric that we use to determine whether or not this sample is contaminated or if it's an accurate representation of not just the total body stores, but the acute exposures and then the mineral derangements themselves. And to your point, the calcium magnesium with the blood sugar ratio can be very symptomatic if you're getting these blood sugar crashes throughout the day. A lot of people start with the postprandial plummet, that 2 or 3 in the afternoon crash where you could just barely hold your eyes away. That's a problem. A lot of times managing chromium, other metals like calcium
Yeah.
and magnesium. And so these ratios really kind of extrapolate a lot of information, and it's a picture of a much bigger puzzle, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So, okay, dive into the thyroid ratio.
So the thyroid ratio, that this is calcium and potassium. So we typically like that number to be around 4. These numbers don't really matter. But what happens is if they're out of range, they can give us an indirect measure and a lot of times an early warning sign of thyroid dysfunction, thyroid dysregulation, even if you have a full thyroid panel, which
Yeah.
very few doctors ever do, including endocrinologists for reasons I still don't understand, probably cost what they were educated in terms of screening. But a full thyroid panel sometimes is normal, and this ratio will be off. And so this is a very sensitive, not
Yeah.
specific way to look at thyroid dysfunction.
Yeah. Good one. Very good one. Yeah. I love that calcium potassium ratio in there. Um, I'll give it, it's a good one. We were talking about blood sugar for a second because this one's not in the ratios, but it's one of the minerals we look at. Vanadium is a mineral, chromium and vanadium. They're really important for blood sugar metabolism. They help us maintain insulin sensitivity, utilize our blood sugar effectively. I had a long-term patient of mine, has done great, was able to get pregnant now, where she was struggling with that because she had chronic illness before. Successful pregnancy recently, doing good, but she was having what her OBGYN and midwife were afraid was some gestational diabetes and blood sugar dysfunction. We ran the hair test. She was really low in vanadium, like basically none. Okay, we started supplementing her with vanadium, which is safe during pregnancy. Her blood sugar management balanced out. Didn't need diabetic medication while pregnant. Didn't need to massively try to restrict her diet. She wasn't eating junk by any means because we were able to see that in the hair test and help correct her blood sugar metabolism up front. Okay, thyroid ratio. We'll talk about a couple different adrenal ratios. A good one is sodium to magnesium. Okay, we can see on that one if it's too high or too low. Again, are the adrenals ramped up and you're real anxious and flighty and can't sleep? Are they too low and you're depleted and fatigued? Exercise intolerance, chronic fatigue syndrome, maybe getting POTS and dizziness. We're trying to look at that sodium. So right with if you have enough sodium, your adrenals can function and bring you up. If you have enough magnesium, they can help you relax and bring you down. But when it's out of balance, you're either going to get way too anxious and too ramped up, or you're going to get too low and too depleted. So that sodium magnesium ratio really helps us look at where is their balance from go and slow. Okay, can you hit the brakes? Can you hit the accelerators? So sodium magnesium ratio is a really good one. What about
well, I was going to add one more thing, and this helps me remember it. So that one has an inverse relationship. So usually the higher the ratio, the lower the functioning. So I like to think of magnesium sodium relation. That way, the number as it goes up corresponds with the overactivation or underactivation. So that can be a easier way just to mentally keep track of it. You wanted to talk about the other adrenal?
No, go ahead. Yeah, jump into the
sodium. So a lot of people know about sodium and potassium, right? These are some people call it the adrenal ratio. It's really aldosterone and cortisone, which are mineral corticoids secreted by the adrenal gland, which sits on top of the kidney. And this can be both an acute and a chronic indicator of adrenal function. It directly corresponds. One of the things we see early on in a metal burden is low, or mold, is very low adrenal function. And over treating the adrenal can actually be too much of a good thing. It can try to restore them to homeostasis too fast. And so this gives us an indication of the severity of what we're seeing on a mineral level of this depletion. And that can help guide our treatment. One, diagnosis, but also predict treatment outcomes and know how to approach them, not to overcompensate, overcorrect, which can cause problems in and of itself.
Yes. Yep. Talk about you got the calcium, potassium. Go ahead and jump into that one.
So I like calcium, potassium, and sodium, magnesium, because both of them can really tell you about globally what the thyroid response is, because the thyroid is the conductor, but the rest of the body has to respond. And so what you can see through these ratios is really a bit more of the overall metabolic rate. What people tend to think, oh, I need to speed up my metabolism, I'm going to eat B vitamins or whatever. This is more of an endocrine hormonal a downstream measure, and it can actually directly correspond to cell danger response too.
Yeah, really. So what I really like to think of the cell danger response, the way I explain this to patients, a lot of people understand a freeze response neurologically, that shut down, kind of withdrawn, fatigued response, right? Freeze response. But in the cells, the cell danger response is essentially a cellular freeze response. Lower metabolism, lower methylation, shut down, restrict, right? So that they can correlate on a cellular level. COVID, long COVID is a cell danger response. Epstein-Barr, heavy metals obviously can cause it, as we're talking about. So it's a biggie.
I call it the safe mode, like on your computer. It seems to be an evolutionary survival mechanism of the cell. It's what it does before apoptosis, before autophagy. It will say, this is my last attempt to go into safe mode, into hibernation, to barely keep this creature alive until help comes.
Yeah. Really interesting way to look at it, like that. Zinc copper is another good one. This one does a couple of different things, right? So zinc copper, that helps us look at connective tissue repair because we need both zinc and copper to repair that. Zinc copper in of itself can be dealing with heavy metals, right? Zinc, we need zinc to detox heavy metals on that front, but also heavy metals can displace zinc. Copper in and of itself, if it gets too high, can be a toxic heavy metal at that point, but we need enough copper to make our connective tissue work, to make our histamine enzymes work, to make our mental challenging works, right? So to make our brain function.
Mold metabolism.
Yes, yeah, good point.
Mold
Copper for mold metabolism. So we need to look at the zinc copper ratio. I don't find as many copper toxic patients as maybe a lot of functional people talk about. I find more imbalanced, maybe copper deficient. That's why it's so important to look at this ratio. Where's the balance at, right? So we look at mineral balancing and not just toxicity deficiency, but we need the right balance. So zinc copper is a really good one to look at that. So people who have chronic cervical instability, hypermobility, EDS, chronic joint and tendon injuries, I want to look at the zinc copper ratio and see, can they repair that? And then zinc copper ratio is also really important for oxidative states. Do you have enough antioxidants? Zinc and copper really balance that for us.
You know why I think a lot of people make this mistake on zinc and copper is because a lot of people don't measure intracellularly, and zinc is has a wealth of functions. I mean, that's why most people have heard of zinc, right, for our immune system. Well, zinc is a cofactor in a lot of reactions, specifically in getting nutrients into the cell. And so people look copper toxic because copper is building up outside the cell.
Yeah.
Because the zinc is so low, it's not helping facilitate that balance, kind of like the push-pull between chromium and vanadium.
Yeah.
So I agree. I don't see as much copper toxicity, except in rare diseases like Wilson's disease, which we see occasionally. I think it's a functional intracellular dysbiosis, if you will, like a mismanaged regulation.
Yeah, it's imbalance. Very rarely, maybe a few times, have I found copper toxicity. It's pretty easy to track where that came from if they have copper toxicity. Copper pipes that are being chelated into their water, they're drinking something like that. If it's, yeah, exactly. Yeah. If it's true copper toxicity, usually it's easy to track down the source on that front. Otherwise, it's usually an imbalance. Something's not pulling it, moving it the right way. Ceruloplasmin, zinc, whatever it is, molybdenum, it's not moving it around correctly. There's something else out of balance.
Now, well, I did write this one down. I was just about to say I didn't write this down. The other thing is copper and lead have an interesting relationship, and that's often missed as well. So copper will help the body hang on or retain to lead. So high copper, I worry more about. It increases your spongibility for limited exposure to lead. Fortunately, lead is mostly gone from paints and fuels and a lot of the common exposure sources. But I've seen a couple cases since the pandemic of lead toxicity in both children and adults, and it is scary. So copper has a lot to do with that. Of course, there was the famous Trader Joe's dark chocolate recall. Guess what? It was heavy in copper and lead.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big one. We share a couple of cases we tracked down. I think Dr. Sylvester in the case really tracked it down to the chocolate was leading to lead poisoning in multiple family members, right?
The entire family.
Yeah. And so we actually have a list on our Keystone blog of the chocolates that they found to be lead, cadmium, and maybe one of their metal toxic, right? So, and that's not, we don't want to blame the companies too much. Cacao, the cocoa beans, the plant actually pulls lead and cadmium out of the soil. And so the darker the chocolate you get, the more lead and heavy metals are going to be in there because of the factor of the way the plant works. And so if some of those areas they're sourcing the chocolate, if the farms are more lead, the soil has more lead and cadmium in the soil, or they're spraying or the water or whatever, then it's going to suck more of it up. And then you're eating a dark chocolate, just has a higher ratio, right? So we don't want to get too angry at the companies because it's just kind of a nature of the plant.
Yeah, and unfortunately, so it's a farming problem, but it's also an industrial problem. So a lot of this dark chocolate, the way that it's manufactured is actually in copper pots. And it's just a coincidence of nature that copper and lead don't play well together within our biology. Yeah. So I agree. It was very unfortunate, but this is a good lesson on how to avoid these toxic metals in our environment.
Yeah, talk about calcium phosphorus.
So calcium phosphorus, I call it the mineralization ratio because I think a lot about it and its interplay with strontium a little bit, which we won't get into. But it's really the metabolic type. It can be an indirect indicator of how much time your body spends in a sympathetic drive versus a parasympathetic drive? How often are you stressed on the go, versus resting and digesting and
Yeah.
turning your immune system on and remineralizing and repairing the damage of the day?
Yeah, no doubt. So that's a biggie. That one, calcium phosphorus ratio, calcium phosphorus levels. If you're dealing with osteopenia or osteoporosis, which is like weakening of the bones, the hair mineral analysis is a great way for us to look and say, okay, what are your levels? What are your ratios? Look, you can take more and more calcium, which is what the medical industry is going to tell you to do. What if your calcium's normal, but your phosphorus is messed up? Your strontium, your boron, right? These are all things you need to make magnesium, to make calcium function appropriately into the bone structure. And so if these things are imbalanced, or for instance, a lot of osteopenia cases, they're toxic in lead, right? And so it's displacing calcium. You can take more and more and more, but it's never going to solve the problem if you don't know. And so a hair test is a great way to say, if you have osteopenia, get a hair test. Let's see what your minerals, let's see what your metals are doing, and then appropriate rebalancing them, not just take a supplement or a prescription willy-nilly trying to
Yeah.
force a situation. Realistically, I don't see those improve a lot of bone density scans very well. Why? Because they're missing the actual problem.
Exactly. And a lot of practitioner functionals are afraid of calcium, and for good reason. To your
Mhm.
point, the problem isn't you need more calcium, right? You need the better balancing and kind of the facilitation within the osteocytes themselves. One interesting difference that we've agreed to disagree on, or we've pondered, in Florida, we do see really high, very high toxic levels in strontium in almost every sample I've ever taken. How often do you see that in Tennessee?
Like never. I don't think I've seen a high strontium case in Tennessee.
So, strontium by and large doesn't interact with our biology too perilously unless it's really high. And then it starts messing with magnesium, calcium,
Mhm.
phosphorus, really the whole bone mineralization process. It affects the way you lay down the matrix of the bone, you repair the bone. It can interfere with the bone strength itself. It leads to osteopenia, osteoporosis, falls,
Yeah.
breaks, and then a lot of times you don't recover from that.
Yeah, difficult. So got to figure out the sourcing of that one. That's another episode. So okay, you guys, you here to talk about the ratios, mineral balancing, why you need a hair test for everything. Really, we use it a lot for heavy metal toxicity. Look, if you turn out you need a hair test, it seems like you're heavy metal toxic, or maybe it's your minerals imbalance pointing to heavy metals. Please don't go trying to detox them willy nilly on your own. Have someone who's educated in heavy metal detox for the reasons we talked about. We'll do another podcast on heavy metal detoxification, steps to avoid, steps to take, but don't just do it willy nilly. As we talked about, we've seen so many injured cases. There's a precise way, a scientific way to do it. There's an art to it that allows you to do it in a safe way, allows you to heal, not to injure yourself or have someone injure you. So that's a biggie. Great ways to do this with mineral balancing. We talked about blood sugar metabolism, adrenal health, metabolic systems, bone health, all sorts of things, right? Thyroid.
And this is just scratching the surface of the information we get from the hair test itself. This is some of the more in depth things just to illustrate the point of how much just from this dead tissue we can learn about the history, the
Yeah.
management, the exposure. It's amazing. And it's hardly ever utilized, or it's misunderstood and misinterpreted.
Yeah. Big one. So I want to end with one quick FAQ frequently asked question is, what about hair dyes or whatever? What about hair dyes? What about permaculture or not permaculture, perms, hair permanence, all that sort of stuff? What's how do we make sure it's accurate?
What's really great about hair analysis is it has these validity measures I mentioned before. So we can catch what's contaminant. For instance, if the calcium magnesium ratio is so far out of range that it really strongly supports that there might be something stuck to the hair shaft from the dye or from a shampoo.
Yeah.
The company actually asks if you do perm, if you do use these chemical treatments, what shampoo you use, because it's known that, for instance, Selsun Blue has selenium. If you see a really off the chart selenium value and it doesn't fit the rest of the picture and the ratios are out of whack, that's strongly suggestive. Oh, this is a contamination.
Yeah.
So it can account for that.
Yeah. So we know if when you mark on there, oh, I use this shampoo or I dye my hair, then we see the test, we can say, okay, that's hair dye, no problem, and move on and read the rest of the test. Guys, you need a hair test. Okay. It's not medical advice, but you need a hair test. If you need one, Mind Body Medicine Florida, Keystone Total Health. We're happy to help you out on that front. Good talking to y'all.
Thanks for joining us.
And be well.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.